And now I'm going to ask Alice Ty to introduce our speaker this afternoon. Alice is a very active member of our programming committee at the Trust, and she's also very dedicated to the history of the built past of New Haven. I was delighted that she was willing to introduce Bruce for us today. Alice.
Thanks, Rona. I am very pleased to introduce our speaker for this afternoon's talk, Dr. Bruce Clouette. Bruce is an historian and industrial archaeologist who has dedicated much of his time and expertise over the past 40 years to educating the public about Connecticut's historic places. In his professional capacity as a researcher and a consultant, Bruce has produced hundreds of reports documenting historic structures throughout Connecticut, with a particular focus on industrial buildings, bridges, and other infrastructure. He is an author and contributor, author of and contributor to numerous books, articles, and exhibitions, and shares his wealth of knowledge through public presentations such as this one. And the Trust has had the pleasure of working with Bruce in many formats over the years, from his contribution to the Trust's publication on New Haven's industrial history, titled Carriages and Clocks, Corsets and Locks, which I've actually just checked out from the New Haven Public Library and look forward to reading. And also many walking tours, including one of the New Haven Green last June for the Festival of Arts and Ideas. Possibly many of you attended that. Bruce also inaugurated the Trust's online talk series in the fall of 2020 with a memorable presentation on the history of New Haven's train stations. A recording of that is available to view online, and you can find a link by going to the events page on the Trust's website, and I highly recommend watching it. All right, I'm going to turn the screen over to Bruce in a moment for his presentation. We will have a question and answer period at the end. And during the talk, you may type any questions that you might have into the chat, and we will attempt to get to them as many of them as possible. I will be monitoring them as they come in, and I'll try to collate them in a organized fashion for Bruce. All right, with that, please join me in welcoming Bruce for his talk, New Haven, a Great Manufacturing City.
Thank you very much, Alice, and thank you all for coming. What I hope to accomplish in this talk is to give a sense of why New Haven became a great manufacturing city. We don't necessarily think of New Haven in terms of manufacturing today because it's so many other things today, an educational center, a financial center. But for much of the 19th and 20th centuries, it really was an industrial powerhouse. Many products were made here. There were factories employing thousands of people. And I think in large part it accounts for what New Haven became. So I think it's an important topic. What were the factors that led to it to become, to have this vibrant industrial sector? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the way that we research industrial history, because I'm a big believer that historians should not obfuscate or mystify the process by which we know things. It's pretty much available to everyone. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. And then I want to focus on about a half dozen specific New Haven enterprises and briefly chart their course, talk about what their products were, how they evolved, and what happened to them. And throughout this, I want us to think about whether industrial history matters to us today. We all know we're in the information age. I mean, let's face it, we're Zooming, right? So we are in the information age. And how does industrial history inform us, or does it? Is it even relevant? So those are the topics that I want to cover today. Before New Haven was an industrial city, it was a thriving port and a center of commerce. And I think it's difficult to overstate this. No place in the United States industrialized without serious investment from commercial wealth. In the case of mills, textile mills like those in Eastern Connecticut, the commercial wealth came from beyond the region, Providence, Hartford, Boston. But there always was a source of wealth. And in New Haven's case, a lot of that source of wealth was the fact that it was a thriving port and a center of commerce. Commercial enterprise was one of the goals of the founders of New Haven, even though for much of the 17th century, it was probably more aspirational than real. But certainly by the middle of the 18th century, commerce, shipping, merchant wealth were all evident in the city of New Haven. I have some statistics here from 1787. First of all, the population of New Haven was 3,820, which for a colonial settlement was a lot of people. There were 7,250 tons of registered shipping. That is 7,000 tons of vessels registered to New Haven. On the average, there were 70 arrivals and departures from the harbor every year. There were 3 shipyards in New Haven. So this was a tremendous amount of activity that, even though there were some disasters and bankruptcies and vessels lost at sea and all of that, on balance, created a lot of wealth. What was the character of that shipping? Well, probably 2/3 of it throughout the 18th century was the West Indies trade. New Haven gathered the products of the New England hinterland, timber, livestock, grain, other provisions, as well as household items that might be needed, and shipped them to the West Indies, in turn returning with molasses, rum, and sugar. Another big factor in the commercial growth of New Haven, particularly toward the end of the 18th century, was shipping of flaxseed to Europe. And I don't really know why Europe didn't have its own flaxseed, but throughout New England, flax was grown. The seeds, which are very, very tiny, were extracted, and then they were shipped out. Final aspect was something called the New Haven South Sea Fleet. This was a fleet of vessels, as many as 20 actually, full-rigged ships that cruised the South Sea harvesting seals. They would bring the seal skins to what was then called Canton, China, and then pick up silk and tea, bring it back, and assuming that they were able to successfully complete the voyage, made a lot of money for New Haven merchants. As a consequence of this commercial growth, New Haven had one of the first, or I think the first bank in Connecticut. New Haven Bank was chartered in 1792, which furthered the availability of investment capital. The industries, or I should say not industries, the crafts that were needed to support shipbuilding, ship refitting, and just shipping in general, also probably gave New Haven a sort of kernel of manufacturing expertise. Blacksmiths, brass founders, iron founders, all of these were rope makers. All of these were needed to create an infrastructure so that ships that called at New Haven wouldn't get stuck there. They needed to be repaired or refitted or re-outfitted, whatever, resupplied. Those things were available in New Haven. So all of that kind of created a base, even though they didn't know it at the time, of course, created a base that would facilitate industrialization. Second of all, New Haven was an administrative center. It was co-capital of Connecticut with Hartford, And the way that worked is both Hartford and New Haven had a state house, and people would come from all over Connecticut, the elected representatives from all the towns, and gather once a year. I think it was spring in Hartford and the fall session was held in New Haven, possibly vice versa, but I think that's what it was. This raised the status and visibility of New Haven as well, because people would be coming from all over the state. People would know New Haven because at least their leading citizens would have traveled there as representatives to the General Assembly. And sort of going along with that, Yale wasn't much at this point, but it was the only college in Connecticut. And virtually every town's minister was educated at Yale. So this too raised the city's profile, I think. Finally, New Haven has always been fortunate in its transportation connections. It's right on Long Island Sound. And for many years, the principal way of moving about, whether you're talking about people moving about or goods moving about, was by coastal vessels. So being on the coast, number one. The second thing was that the road system of Connecticut from a very early period had New Haven as one of its convergence points. Other towns, because New Haven was a big town, a commercial center, et cetera, people wanted to get there. So there were roads that were laid out that allowed New Haven to extract the farm products and other aspects of the agricultural hinterland and ship them out, but also allowed people to move relatively easily to New Haven as opposed to other places that were functionally remote. This map of the turnpikes established in the 1790s, early 1800s, were private companies that hopefully improved the roads and then charged tolls. But this did overall facilitate land transportation. And this map of the turnpikes of Connecticut actually corresponds very closely to a later phase of transportation development, which was the building of the railroads. In between there, of course, you have the Farmington Canal. This was an ambitious attempt on the part of New Haven merchants to further cement that relationship to the hinterland by constructing a canal all the way to Northampton, Massachusetts. And although it was only in operation for a relatively short amount of time, and it was succeeded by a railroad, it did cement New Haven's relationship with some of the nascent industrial centers to the north. The Farmington Canal went through Hamden, Mount Carmel in particular, had some early manufacturing, and then Cheshire, Southington, Plainfield, et cetera. So the canal actually set up relationships between New Haven and other towns that were to play an important role in early industry. I want to say something about location. We all know the cliche from real estate, right? Location, location, location. And New Haven's location had two aspects that will continue to play out in this story. One, it's near other important centers of industry in Connecticut. So you have the clock industry developing the Bristol Plainfield area. You have hardware developing in New Britain. You have firearms developing in Hartford, Springfield, and Norwich. You have the brass industry developing in Waterbury. All of these places are reasonably close to New Haven. The other side of its locational advantage is it's not that far from New York City. New York was a second-rate city until the Erie Canal opened, and then it left all the other cities behind in terms of its influence on a nationwide distribution system, its growth, the vibrancy of its commerce. New Haven is not that far away from New York. So situated between New York on the one hand and everything going on there, and all these clever tinkerers, Yankee mechanics and everything on the other hand, just from a locational point of view, New Haven had an advantage. What is the distinguishing character of New Haven's industrialization? Arthur B. Underwood, a journalist for a second-rate Bridgeport newspaper, in 1897 summarized it this way: the distinguishing characteristic of New Haven business interests is their manifold variety. There is hardly a commodity of extensive use, from a needle to an engine, that is not manufactured in this city. That's his first insight. The second part of it is the products of New Haven concerns can be found in every quarter of the globe. So the 2 points are there's tremendous variety of industry in New Haven. And in many cases, these enterprises grew to a point that they were major players in the national market and even the international market for industrial goods. And I'm a little embarrassed that a second-rate journalist came up with this, and I have not found a way to improve upon it. So I'll just give him credit for it and say, that's it in a nutshell. Now, in preparing this talk, I made a list of all the products that were made in New Haven that I could identify. Get a life, right? But I did. And I thought I would share that with you because it's pretty interesting. Yeah, did I zoom in? Okay, so look at the variety of products that there are here. Some of them are very specific, bird cages. Others are kind of generic, garments. And that's because some firms produce an incredible variety of products using all the same production techniques, and I couldn't possibly list them all. So beer and carbonated beverages, patent medicines. I'm not going to list them all. In some cases, though, I have listed some of the specialties. For example, I list both corsets here and garments. And later on in my presentation, you'll see why I did that, because my contention is that corsets are way more than garments. But at any rate, it's an impressive list. I came up with 63 different things that at one time or another were actually made here in New Haven. And as I say, some of these became huge things. Matches, that's the international match. That was huge. Sewing machines, not so much, but whether they were large or small, the variety was really impressive. I'd like to start by talking about a company that has fascinated me for years. Now, I'm embarrassed to say I have heard the name of the company pronounced Cowles and also pronounced Coles. So I'm not 100% sure of the way that it should be pronounced. I know that the family that the originator of this company, Chandler Cowles, came from, pronounced it Cowles. So I think I'll stick with that. C. Cowles and Company was an aspect of the first industry that New Haven could claim as being predominant in more than any other city, and that's the carriage industry. But Coles didn't produce carriages. Cole produced the accoutrements, the furnishings that went into building a carriage. In fact, you could contend that carriage building never became industrialized in New Haven. The final assembly of carriages, the painting of carriages, was largely a matter of handwork. However, starting from the very earliest James Brewster carriages in the 1820s, these were made in quantity. And I want to distinguish between quantity production and industrialization and mechanization. You can produce things in quantity. For example, New Haven produced millions of pairs of shoes in the early 1800s, all by hand. So you don't need to mechanize to produce in quantity. The secret to quantity production is you have a market for the quantity. So when Brewster opened his first carriage office in New York City, he got tied in with those merchants that had access to a national market. Before that, nobody needed to produce hundreds of carriages, never mind thousands of carriages. But once you're tied into that national market, now you need to make a lot of carriages. The components of carriages were increasingly mechanized from that point on. Carriage axles in Mount Carmel, carriage springs in other parts of Hamden, carriage bolts in Southington, and fittings in New Haven. C. Cowles was one of the companies that produced carriage fittings. That was lamps, that was curtain clips, dozens, literally dozens of individual small brass parts, all being produced by machinery for this industry. They were pretty small, always between 100 and 200 people throughout the 19th century. Here's a little example. On the left, we have a worker showing a Coles carriage lamp, and that's a gas illuminated lamp. And you can see they're all laid out on a workbench there. I've got a close-up from eBay, no less, of a couple of Cowles lamps. And then on the right, I have an advertisement from a trade magazine that shows just how special these things are. I mean, I could not identify what those pieces of brass are. And I don't know if you can read the fine print or not, but it's pretty specialized things. A spring roller support. Who needed? You needed a spring roller support. What the heck is a landing hook? You know, a pole tip and handles. So there's a lot that goes into a carriage, and a company like Cowles is producing all the components that go into that carriage. That they were not unique. There were other carriage parts manufacturers in New Haven, and I mentioned the axles. The New Haven Wheel Company made the actual wheels, and they made thousands upon thousands of carriage wheels a year, both for the Brewster Company and for all the successor companies. Carriage companies were active in New Haven and were a tremendous part of its industrial sector to around 1900. And I'm sure you don't have to think too hard as to what happened after that. Carriages, beginning in the late 1890s, were completely eclipsed by automobiles. Wagons were completely eclipsed by trucks. And New Haven's carriage industry evaporated. But C. Cowles and Company did not. They were able to transition from providing components for carriages to providing components for trucks and automobiles. So up there in the upper left, you see a pair of lamps that look a lot like carriage lamps. But if you look down in the corner, you can see the electrical cord. So these are electric lights that were actually used in the production of automobiles. In the middle, there's a very fancy carriage lamp, but that was for motorized limousines. And even the door handles on the right, the upper right there, they look like carriage handles, right? Because some of the early automobiles, the handles and other things were sort of, they called it the horseless carriage, right? And literally it was a horseless carriage. And Cowles just started making the same sort of parts, but for the automobile industry. Down there in the lower left-hand corner, you have door handles, Cowles door handles that are very much like modern car door handles. And then in the lower right-hand corner, you have chrome-plated plastic automobile molding that is still made by Cowles today, albeit not in New Haven, but is both provided to the automobile industry and sold through auto stores for do-it-yourselfers. So Cowles made the transition from carriages, survived the death of the carriage industry by converting to automobile parts production, changed from making things from brass to making things out of plastic, and still is around today. That's a remarkable story. And I think it's an intriguing one, and it's one that should intrigue all New Haven residents. So I'd like to go from a very small enterprise to one that became huge. That's Winchester Repeating Arms Company up on Winchester Avenue. It became just a huge enterprise, 3 million square feet at its height, about 2,000 workers at its height. Interestingly enough, Oliver Winchester, while he was a New Haven manufacturer, he was making shirts and got the idea he would invest some of his money in the manufacture of firearms, about which he did not know very much. However, he invested with, hang on just a minute, Horace Smith and Daniel Wesson, who were making a revolutionary kind of firearm in Norwich, Connecticut. Those of you who are gun enthusiasts will say, that's Smith and Wesson? Yes, that's Smith and Wesson. So Winchester recognized a good opportunity to invest. He did so. He brought the Smith and Wesson's company called Volcanic Repeating Firearms to New Haven. It was soon called New Haven Repeating Firearms. And when it went bankrupt, he bought up all the stock and continued to produce this revolutionary firearm, which was available both as a pistol and as a rifle. As the name suggests, you got more than one shot. Everyone wanted to have the chance for a second shot, third, fourth, fifth, sixth shot, what have you. And this provided it. He moved to Bridgeport. And this is a curious thing. I don't know why, but at that point, P.T. Barnum was trying to develop Bridgeport industry. Barnum had lured sewing machine companies to Bridgeport, and there's a lot of commonalities between firearms production and sewing machine production. I think that's why he went there. And I don't know why he left, but he came back and in 1870 started building this fantastic factory in New Haven. Now, the firearms is another aspect of proximity that I think New Haven experienced. Firearms are being made not only in New Haven at the Eli Whitney factory, well, Hamden actually, but near New Haven, also in places like Norwich, Hartford, Springfield. So this part of New England was really the birthplace of the firearms industry. So that's another example of proximity working to New Haven's advantage. Here's a patent drawing of Winchester's repeating rifle, and you can see the date, 1866. So he continued, and I don't mean him personally, but his people, his machinists, mechanics, continued to improve the repeating firearm until it truly became perhaps America's foremost firearm. Interestingly enough, although during wartime, Winchester produced a lot of military related things, Winchester was primarily a consumer-oriented firearms. And you can see from the advertisement there how they were going to lure consumers. You just got to believe that 9/10 of the people that bought Winchester firearms were wannabe mountain men, not actual mountain men, right? So it was technical innovation. It was innovation in being able to produce by the hundreds of thousands, and it was marketing. Winchester Repeating Firearms Company, until very recent times, was New Haven's foremost employer, employing men, women, by the hundreds, by the thousands, really. And this is a story that really only ended in very recent times. And evidence of that story may continue as the Winchester buildings are repurposed for other things. My next example is the New Haven Clock Company. Now, I talked about carriages and how important they were, but by 1850, clocks were the major employer in New Haven. The Jerome Clock Company, Chauncey Jerome, started off in Bristol, Connecticut, which after all was the birthplace of the American clock industry. In Bristol, very early on in the 19th century, some New York merchants convinced Eli Terry to produce 4,000 wooden clock movements. They were convinced that they could sell 4,000 movements, and that's the key thing. He didn't know how he was going to make them, and he ended up making them with wooden gears, and it was a huge success. So for a number of years, Bristol developed a clock industry based on wooden gears. Jerome had the insight that a lot better than wood would be brass stamped gears. And these brass stampings enabled him to make not only a much cheaper clock movement, but a much more a clock movement that fit together much better, and a clock movement that could travel. Because after all, these things are being exported on the Farmington Canal, then shipped to coastal cities, and the wooden gears were not holding up as well as they should. So Jerome made a tremendous technical innovation. And as soon as he showed the feasibility of a brass gear movement, all of American clockmaking went over to brass gears. Well, his Bristol factory, he wanted to expand it. He figured, if I'm shipping all these clocks to New Haven, why should I expand in Bristol? Let me go to New Haven and set up a clock factory there. And in the meantime, he did set up a clock factory with Hiram Camp, his nephew. And then his Bristol works burned, and so he was committed to New Haven, and this was the first iteration of the New Haven Clock Company up there in, what's the name of the street? Is that Hamilton Street? I'm not sure. But at any rate, Chauncey Jerome clockmaker. Unfortunately, Chauncey Jerome, businessman, was a bit of a disaster. He went into business with P.T. Barnum in the early 1850s. And believe me, you didn't go into business with P.T. Barnum without checking your pockets frequently. They had a falling out. Jerome went bankrupt. They had a huge feud, blaming the other for it. And as a result, Jerome's nephew, Hiram Camp, who was operating part of the operation as New Haven Clock, took over the whole thing. The Jerome factory burned, but was rebuilt, and New Haven Clock Company persevered until the end of the 1950s. This was an amazing operation. They made clocks in every conceivable form: wall clocks, shelf clocks, novelty clocks, clocks that ordinary people could afford, really high-end gilded frou-frou clocks that only the wealthy could afford. And the interesting thing about it is that these clocks appeared very different. It looked like there was endless variety of New Haven clocks, but in point of fact, there were only 4 or 5 movements powering all of them. So they made the same basic brass movement and just put it in all these different shells, and it looked like there was just no end. In fact, there is no end to the variety of New Haven clocks. There were just hundreds, if not thousands, of different designs. I really like the tennis clock. Again, keeping abreast of marketing. You know, as tennis became really popular in the 1890s, okay, we're going to have a tennis clock. As gas fixtures, you know, came in, okay, we're going to have a clock that's illuminated by gas. I'm not sure I feel real comfortable about that. One of my favorites is the 1930s flip clock down in the bottom there. Many of you will remember flip clocks, the first clock with a digital readout, right? The clock, literally the little things with the numbers on it were like I would say it was like a Rolodex, except nobody's going to know what a Rolodex is anymore. But anyway, the numbers flipped as the clock ran, and it was powered by electricity. By the way, the first New Haven electric clock was brought out in the 1890s. So like Sea Cowls, they were keeping abreast of the market. They were keeping abreast of technology. And they produced, I don't know how many clocks, probably millions of clocks over the course of time. I want to say a few words before I go on about how do we know all this? There's just a lot of sources out there, many of them online that you can get in and you can read about. So one of them is these biographical and commercial compilations. I suspect that these were things that you paid to get into. And the reason I suspect that is because, oh, sorry. I'm very sorry. I hadn't meant to do that. I'm trying to get the Zoom. Okay, there. Now you can read it, right? Oh, the excellent established reputation for excellent workmanship, elegant finish, durability, the best, unsurpassed. I got a feeling that Manville and Dudley wrote this themselves, right? This is not an objective source of information on this, but it is a source of information. You know, it has the people that were involved, where their factory was, how big, large 3-story building, the dimensions, etc. So it's a source of information. It's just not an objective source of information. But that's one of the things we use. Virtually all these New Haven industries appear in one of these business compilations that came out, you know, pretty much regular intervals every 10 years or so. Another thing that we use to understand industrial history is our patent records. These are all available online. This is a very interesting, to me at least, case. Edward Harrison. Harrison, like so many machinists, manufacturers in New Haven, wanted to apply the principles of precision machinery to an everyday object, which in his case was the grist mill. You know, the grist mill was unchanged for hundreds of years. It was 2 huge stones slowly rotating about each other, grinding grain. And he thought, oh, I can improve on this. And he did. And here's a patent for one of his grist mills. He started actually in the 1850s, but this is the 1872 model. And it's got bearings. It's got metal gears. It's driven by overhead shafting and belts. And it's small, it's compact. There isn't a lot of schlepping grain from one thing to another. You just pour it in one end and grain comes out the other end. It's a perfect example of how precision manufacturing transformed products. Unfortunately, Harrison was just doing this when all of American flour production, feed production was moving to the Midwest. It was moving to the huge roller mills of Buffalo, Minneapolis, those places. And so, although he had some modest success, it was essentially a dead end. It was precision manufacturing for a product that people really didn't need, except for a few country grist mills that maybe would try one of these things. So interesting. Census records is something else that we look at. And here we see the 1870 census. Edward Harrison recorded as a manufacturer in New Haven, and you can see he was doing pretty well. That's $9,000 in real estate, $12,000 in other assets, which was notable for the times. Not the richest man in New Haven by any means, but certainly a good, solid citizen, and the type of person who could afford a live-in housekeeper, who, by the way, was an Irish immigrant and who had her daughter with her. So we learn more we learned some things, not everything, but some things from the federal census. Now, it's only available on microfilm at the State Library, but there also was a census of industry from 1850 to 1880, where they asked every industrial concern about their product, about their employees, what they paid women, what they paid men, what they paid for skilled labor, what they paid for unskilled labor, et cetera, et cetera. It was never the same questions every year. And because of COVID, I couldn't get to the State Library and put one of those in the talk, but that's another kind of census schedule that is very useful to historians of industry. Government reports. Bureau of Labor Statistics. Every major strike that occurred was written up and reported on for about 20 years by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And here's an example of one of their reports on strikes. This happens to be the tobacco strippers in New Haven. New Haven had a couple of pretty large-scale tobacco cigar factories, and the tobacco strippers were sort of the semi-skilled workers as opposed to the cigar rollers who were the skilled workers. And so here's a little report on their attempt to get higher wages, which they actually did, unusually enough. Here's another thing that is in the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Every year they reported on factory construction. This year, which was what, 1907, I think it was, $400,000 in factory construction just that one year in New Haven, which is quite a lot. And it breaks it down by company, by building, gets the dimensions, the cost, and some years they say how many more employees that was going to accommodate too. So that's another good source. Yeah, that's the 1906 report. We look at old maps to understand the changes in the footprint of buildings. There you see the Jerome Clock Company on 1868. Then on the left, you see the 1879 bird's eye view. And interestingly enough, the New Haven Clock Company is divided between, I'm going to get a cursor here, I hope. Do you see my cursor? At any rate, a factory for movements on one side of the street and a factory for cases on the other side of the street. When we talk about the New Haven Clock Company today, only the caseworks survive. The movement works were obliterated by the construction of I-91. Then there are aerial photographs of Connecticut about every 10 or 15 years, starting in 1934, and we can study the footprint of buildings using those aerial photographs. There are insurance surveys that give us the details of what went on in those buildings in much greater detail. And again, where's my zoom? So if we zoom up here, we see box making, finishing, varnishing, buffering, or buffing, gluing, veneering, all the individual processes that resulted in a clock case. Some statistical stuff. This is from 1886. There's 500 people working in the case works, probably another 500 in the movement works. So they're already up to maybe 1,000 employees. But this tells you what went on every floor. The architecture of industrial buildings very much changed over time as they sought to make them more fireproof, as they sought to make them more efficient in terms of moving materials. So you see when elevators are introduced, you see how lighting is changed and so forth. And these insurance surveys, which were not produced for the companies themselves, it was produced for insurance companies, so they would know, is the New Haven Caseworks, is that a big insurance risk? Yes or no? So that's why those were produced. They're great things to have. Archival sources. The University of Connecticut has got a number of archives that are related to New Haven industries, but also to New Haven labor organizations. And the New Haven Museums, I so urge you to support the New Haven Museum, formerly known as the New Haven Colony Historical Society. They are just a treasure trove of photographs, of trade catalogs, of memorabilia, all kinds of things relating to New Haven industry. And sometimes these old photographs are the only, or one of the rare opportunities we have to experience the lives of workers, as well as the entrepreneurs, the capitalists that started these factories. Finally, we learn about industrial history by examining artifacts. This is a New Haven clock from the 1920s. How do we know that? The style of lettering. However, these clocks are the same design superficially as clocks that were first introduced in the early 1800s. And we can look at this and say, oh, there's a mahogany clock, but a closer inspection reveals it's not mahogany, it's mahogany stain. Oh, this is a lovely painted ship on the concealing the pendulum. Well, not really. It's a transfer, reverse on glass transfer, and so on and so forth. You can really understand how these clocks were made, what level of consumption this clock was aimed at. And by the way, this is the one in my living room. So I really like this clock. I'd like to resume my survey of New Haven industry. The Strauss-Adler Company, and they had a couple of different names, Mayer, Strauss and Company, produced corsets and later other kinds of women's underwear in this huge factory, 2,000 employees at its peak, of which is highly visible. I think that's one of the things about this that makes it very important to preserve this. This is right at the State Street station, just south of New Haven's commercial core, very prominent. And of course, we all have the sign smoothie, which is actually a 20th century concept. This is one of the great New Haven industries. This shows how New Haven developed large factories that were among the largest in the world, even though they were not the center of that industry. So the Strauss-Adler factory, one of the largest corset factories in America, probably in the world, but New Haven did not dominate the corset industry. Corsets were made in Bridgeport, in Norwalk, in Derby. So New Haven is kind of the eastern edge of the production of corsets. If you look at the lower image, lower left-hand image, you see that it mentions their showroom in New York, and that's a key thing. Corsets are made in Connecticut because Connecticut has access to marketing in New York. Mayer, Adler, and Strauss, three partners, only one of whom was in New Haven, overseeing the production of corsets. The other two were in New York, making sure that they could sell their corsets. If you look on the letterhead in the upper right there, you see that Mayer, Strauss and Company, they mention the factory in New Haven, but it's all about the medals that they've won. It's all about the showroom, 412 Broadway, right? You cannot ever underplay the importance of the commercial connection in sustaining industry. Now, I said that corsets were not only a garment. Obviously, they're a garment, but they're also hardware. And if you look at the corset there, a Strauss-Adler corset, you can see what I mean. There's, and again, let me see if I can find, are you seeing my cursor? Let me see if I can find this pointer. So here we have buttons or snaps, right? Over here we have eyelets, which are you remember the Scarlett O'Hara thing and Gone with the Wind? That's where you thread the cord through and pull to tighten the corset. You have eyelets, and these things are all the stays, which are spring steel. There's so much metal in a corset that during World War I, the government tried to restrict corset production just because it was taking up so much metal. And that's spring steel, by the way, so it's a specialty metal. It fascinates me that New Haven got this corset production because it was both close to and had access to New York and had access to all these little metal parts and bigger metal parts, the springs. The important thing is that, or an important thing is that corsets were subject to fashion. And the fashion was the shape that resulted from the corset. So the shape that was good at one point in time changed over time, and you got less of an uplift or you got more hips or what have you. You got a different shape. And so the corset manufacturer had to be ready to change. It had to be ready to redesign the corset so that it catered to popular taste. Now, a lot of that taste was coming from Europe, and you notice that the Mayer Strauss corset was called à la Spirit, which suggests that it was a French corset. So much, much better, right? But this was being distributed to the middle class through women's magazines and also general purpose magazines. I will say it's kind of sobering. You know, as a male, I feel this tie greatly constrains me. But how about that corset? You know, I mean, that really does raise whole questions about our culture or that culture and patriarchy and how women were trying to live up to expectations, et cetera. And interestingly enough, after a brief period of mostly employing child labor, Mayer Strauss Adler was mostly employing women to make these things. You know, I used to say, I'm really fascinated by women's undergarments, but the reaction I got was often kind of strange. So now I try to soft pedal it and say I'm interested in the history of women's undergarments. Here's another New Haven industry. It became a huge success, Sargent Hardware. This is the hardware factory, which is down on Water Street, right on the harbor, in this bird's eye view. Sargent's both had access to the railroad, which is very important, and it had access to waterborne commerce. It had its own docks bringing in coal and metal. It made its own metal in its own rolling mills, and it produced hardware of all sorts. Now, how this got started, I think is interesting because the New Haven's Sargent Hardware Factory was an amalgam of New York and New Britain. The founder, Joseph B. Sargent, and his four brothers were New York wholesale hardware merchants. And some of their hardware was coming from this company in New Britain, which is not even a town at that point. And the Peck and Walter Manufacturing Company. It was not small, you know, it was capital worth $100,000. So it wasn't the smallest place in New Britain by any means. And they came on hard times, and Sargent was having trouble getting the hardware that he needed. And he just decided to buy the hardware company in New Britain. So here there's New York merchant who buys a hardware company in New Britain and finally decides that he's going to set up production in New Haven. So that's the proximity effect, right? You have the effect, both the proximity to the New Haven merchant that knows how to sell the hardware, how to get that hardware into the nationwide distribution chain. And you have the sort of mechanics and machinists, the New Britain types, who are not that far from New Haven. Sargent started out supplying some hardware to the carriage industry, making some hand tools, but very quickly went over into builders hardware. Their catalog ran to 1,000 pages by the 1890s. By the early 1900s, their catalogs contained more than 60,000 items. These catalogs, by the way, were not for consumers. They were for hardware jobbers and other firms that would buy hardware by the case. This was a huge company employing multiple thousands of people. And it lasted a good long time. My last case study, if you will, is H.B. Bigelow. Hobart B. Bigelow was trained as a machinist not that far away in Guilford. And like any enterprising young man, he figured he was too big for Guilford and went to work for a machine shop in New Haven, finally rose to become foreman of that shop, finally bought out that shop and set up his own machine shop. He didn't set out to become H.B. Bigelow and Company. He did general machine work. He made some steam engines, he made some valves, he made some fittings, just whatever he could. But very quickly began to specialize in the production of boilers. H.B. Bigelow became the largest provider of boilers in the United States. These were for power plants, these were for heating, these were, when you think of all the industrialization that was going on, every single one of those factories after about 1850 or so needed a steam engine. Even those that were water powered were supplementing with steam power. And Hobart B. Bigelow was there to help them. So he located to New Haven from not that far away. He also aided other New Haven industries. For better or worse, Bigelow located his machine works not on a rail line. He located it on the harbor. Let me enlarge that map for you. He located it on a harbor in the convergence of the Quinnipiac River with New Haven Harbor. And that was really good if you were making boilers because you got coal, you got metal, you could ship them out by barge and so forth. But he really decided he needed rail access. And being the enterprising sort he was, he made his own railroad. And this was the Manufacturers Street Railway in the 1890s. And here's where it went. I'm trying to find my, it went along River Street to serve Bigelow Boiler Works and the related National Pipe Bending works. But it also benefited other works on River Street. And you see over there on the side, some of the many industries, Foskett and Bishop, ladders were made on River Street, plumbing fixtures, sprinkler systems, just a whole range of things. That A&P had one of its first major warehouses on River Street, all of which benefit. Quinnipiac Brewery got supplies and shipped out product via this street railway. It was electrified. General Electric's first electric locomotive ran on this railroad. It was a big deal and got a lot of national attention. Here's where it went. It went from all along River Street, a little ways up James Street, then over to a kind of private right-of-way, and eventually ended up at the southern edge of where the Cedar Hill Yard is there and connected with the New Haven Railroad. Bigelow's ran this railway till 1907, and at that point, it was bought by the New Haven Railroad. It was eventually dieselized, and within living memory, at least people of my age, there still were railroad tracks down River Street. So this shows how one industry in New Haven benefited a whole range of other industries, largely through the larger industries just spawned all these smaller industries, either by providing them with transportation in this case, and the smaller industries sustained the larger industries because all of this component work was being subbed out to the small machine shops, the smaller manufacturers who were providing components to these larger industries. Well, that's it in a nutshell. And I'd like to end by just kind of ruminating a little about why industrial history is important, what we can learn from it. I think the first and major thing is realizing that New Haven as we know it today, our lives as we know them today, is the product of the past, including that period of the 19th and early 20th century when America industrialized. I have some figures here. From 1850 to 1880, New Haven's population tripled. From 1880 to 1910, it more than doubled again. And that was pretty, New Haven, except for some peaks during the 1920s and World War II, is still not at its 1910 level of population. So clearly industrialization, the scale of the factories, the workers, all the enterprises that were sustained by having this huge industrial sector led to the growth of the city. It is what it is today. From a cultural point of view, our grandparents, this is their history, working in these factories, the 10-hour days, 6.5 days a week, the unions, and also the achievement of a middle-class lifestyle by factory workers in the World War II and immediate post-World War II period. This is the history of many of us, our grandparents and great-grandparents. I think we also learned from industrial history that things change. Sometimes they change slowly and sometimes they change quickly. So the carriage industry developed fairly slowly and disappeared quickly. Other things happened very, very quickly. The introduction of brass-geared clocks just swept industry just like a tidal wave, not just clocks. I mean, things that were made out of wood and made out of tin and so forth were made out of brass for 100, 120 years. We also learned that life is not always onward and upward. I mean, think about poor Chauncey Jerome transforming the American clock industry, falling into the clutches of P.T. Barnum, going bankrupt and losing everything he had. He died a pauper. Think about those carriage makers. Think about Edward Harrison, making a reasonable living, but essentially at a dead-end industry. Too often, we concentrate our understanding of history on the successful, and rightly so. I mean, New Haven has some tremendous success stories, Sargent, New Haven Clock, at least, through the post-industrial period. Tremendous success stories, Strauss-Adler. But at the same time, we have to always remember that not everything was a success. And that implies for us that our history, as we move forward, as we create history, is not always going to be onward and upward. I think that's an important thing to realize. Finally, I think that properly interpreted, and this is kind of the role of the museums, the historical societies, and the preservation trusts to a certain degree. I think that industrial history encourages us to appreciate complexity, because New Haven, it wasn't a linear thing. New Haven had transportation, therefore developed this class of machinists and mechanics and transportation improvements. It wasn't a linear thing. Each of these things fed back on the other. And we see that continually, that the industries advance through a process of attracting mechanics, say, And the more they attract mechanics, the bigger they grow. The bigger they grow, the more they attract mechanics. So that's really the way history works. And I can't think of a better example of that than studying industrial history. For my closing, I put the Hendrix birdcage in. I didn't mention the Hendrix. You know, you can still buy Hendrix bird cages at Walmart. They're made in China, and it's really just a brand name. That isn't it amazing that this symbol of the Victorian age, this symbol of New Haven's variety of industry, still perseveres, at least as a name. Now, I'd like someone to tell me what bird went in that cage with a moving wheel. It looks like a horror show to me, but they had a million different kinds of bird cages that you could buy. No Victorian home was real, no middle-class Victorian home was complete without a Hendrix bird cage at one time. You know, if you had to pick a nutshell, you could tell the whole story of New Haven industry just from bird cages. There's a lot else here, excuse me, that I didn't do. You know, I had the 63 different industries, and I only talked about 6 of them. I could have picked any one of those and made the same points. So that's what I have to say. And now I encourage you to type in questions, comments, remembrances into the chat, and Alice will be coordinating that. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Bruce. That was fantastic and very rich and detailed and illuminating. So yes, please type any questions you might have into the chat. I've gotten a couple. Just so everyone knows, a copy of this talk will be posted online. So a recording will be available of Bruce's presentation and the talk. Not immediately, but it will be posted on the NHPT website, and I believe also on the YouTube channel. So yeah, all right. So we'll start diving into the questions. I guess to back up a little bit, going all the way back to the sort of early, these are 2 quick questions about specific products in the 18th century trade section. 1, what was flaxseed used for? And 2, there's a mention of Underwood. There's a question to clarify whether those are Underwood typewriters.
He's not this, to take the last one, he's not the same Underwood, to his regret, I suspect. He was just a journalist, and he wrote about industry in New Haven and Waterbury and Meriden, and a lot of what we know is from his writings. Flaxseed, incredibly enough, flax seeds were crushed to make oil. Flaxseed as a fiber is used to make linen, but you've heard of linseed oil? Linseed is flax seeds. And for many years, the only available solvents for a whole variety of things was, but mostly paints and varnishes, was linseed oil or fish oil. I think I'd rather paint with linseed oil.
And linoleum. It's a
oh yeah, linoleum, lincrusta, you know, yeah. I mean, those are two byproducts. You know, it boggles the mind to think how many flax seeds you need to make a quart of linseed oil, right?
So we have a couple of questions about, I guess, charting the peak of New Haven as an industrial city. We have one question that just asked, you know, why did New Haven stop being successful in an industrial city? And then, you know, what year would you say was the peak year for the New Haven economy and why?
Yeah, I would say 1930. That was a sort of, so there was another peak in World War II, but I'm not going to count that because wartime production, you know, New Haven Clock went over to making fuses for mines and things like that. They weren't really making clocks in World War II. And so that World War II production was kind of a blip. I think that there's probably a lot of very specific reasons. I mean, New Haven Clock, I think, made a mistake in going into watches, which wasn't its prime product. And I think that was probably probably a mistake. There was a lot of competition from other clock makers. Clocks were almost entirely electric by the late 50s when they were going. So you had Timex and West Clocks and all these other. Sargent hardware, they continue today, but it's made elsewhere in the world. Cowles continue today. I think maybe some of their production is Connecticut. I think some of the production is other places. That's a whole story of deindustrialization, right? And I'm not sure I can really indicate why it happened. I just know it happened. I know that increasingly the industrial buildings of New Haven were used for warehouses. So that's not a highest and best use. I know increasingly industries moved to the suburbs. Cowles moved to the suburbs. You could say that Sargent moved to the suburbs by building that suburban style factory on Long Wharf. Of course, Interstate 91 wiped out both Sargent and the New Haven Clock Company in terms of part of their physical plant. So highway construction was not kind to industry in cities. I just don't know. I don't think I have the whole answer as to why things changed, but they certainly did. I mean, you are not back to the population of New Haven in 1910. And the 20s were pretty good because places like Cowles were going over into producing for automobiles. Automobile industry was a tremendous driver of the American economy throughout the 1920s and 1930s. You don't realize it, but automobile ownership went up every year in the Depression. So any industry that was tied to automobiles was okay for quite a long time in the 1930s. But after World War II, things seem to have changed. That'll have to be my next talk, deindustrialization.
Deindustrialization is a whole other talk. It occurs to me that if you stop sharing your screen, I think your face will then go full screen. It might be.
Is that a good thing?
Yeah, totally. A little more engaging.
Okay, there you go. All right, any other questions?
We have a lot, actually. They're pouring in. Okay, so we have two questions, similar questions about power sources. So New Haven didn't have very much water power compared to some inland cities, but it was a big benefit to Eli Whitney early on when were alternate diesel power sources first available. Did that impact many New Haven companies?
A lot of the pre-Civil War industries were water powered, including in the New Haven area. Like in Hamden, there were the carriage axle factories that were water powered. There was the Whitney arms factory that was water powered. But this is right when things are changing over to steam power. So what you needed was coal. If you need coal and you need transportation, ideal for New Haven. It's got this big harbor, all these places where coal can be unloaded, and all these places making boilers and steam engines and so forth so that they can power their factories with steam. And New Haven is kind of like Fall River, Massachusetts. It was almost entirely steam powered. Starting around, I would say 1910, 1920, the electric power industry is mature enough so that they start powering factories with electricity. But they didn't change very much because instead of a steam engine, they just put a big electric motor in and ran the belting. So up until World War II, most New Haven factories were still belt powered with power going through line shafting to the individual machines. Finally, with the suburban style industries like in North Haven or Sargent on Sargent Drive, you have fluorescent lighting, all electric. Each machine's got its own electric motor. That's modern industrial production. But New Haven's production was almost 100% related to steam and therefore to transportation.
Fabulous. Okay, so we've had a couple questions also specifically about the Winchester Repeating Arms Factory. If you could tell us, I don't know, how current you are with the the developments happening there right now, but there's a question of exactly how much is left of the original factory, and sort of what's happening.
Yeah.
At that.
I would say with all of New Haven's historic industrial complexes, there has been a tremendous pruning down. Of course, obviously most severe in the case of HB Bigelow, which has virtually disappeared. But the thing about Winchester, 3 million square feet, there's so much that Winchester can take a lot of paring. And if paring down is what is needed to make it successful as a technology park or as a residential development, I'm all in favor of it. And I think it will allow something to remain that will still impress people with a tremendous scale. The thing about Strauss-Adler in Winchester and, Sargent before it was demolished was the size of the place. The sheer scale of it. I think it's something that it's just hard to just read about or see a photograph and appreciate. And I'm hoping that Winchester can continue to do that for New Haven. But I don't know how viable it is or what the current ones are.
I'm curious in your, in your experience as a consultant, like what are the biggest roadblocks to adaptive reuse of these types, specifically of industrial buildings?
I would say one of the big roadblocks, in the case of Bigelow, it was a long period of vacancy. Vacancy is not kind to buildings, let's face it. Beyond that, I think that there's a certain size industrial building that can be successfully developed. And once you get above that size, it becomes a real challenge. I mean, Winchester is so big, maybe Yale could develop it as a technology park or something, but then you're really getting into a size. I think that New Haven Clock is maybe right on the verge of being too big. It's big, but probably not too big. And I think that will probably succeed as a residential development. Those are some of the things. I saw someone comment, how come all the buildings are from the 1880s? Well, it's just a case of these were prosperous companies. And I like one of the views of Sargent I showed the build out to the max and then the tiny little vignette, the way they started in 1870 down there on Water Street. So they just had to keep building and building and building and tear down the old, build up 3 times bigger. And then you have the economic factors, particularly during World War I, when so many factories were not only involved in war production, but were involved, the European economy collapsed. So factories throughout America were just running full steam ahead, and they built these new reinforced concrete buildings. You saw that at Cowles, you saw that at Strauss-Adler, saw that at New Haven Clock. They just tremendous build out during World War I, and so we don't have the really ancient buildings. And when we do, we should appreciate it. But the fact of the matter is, these people weren't thinking, oh, we've got to delight the historic preservationists of the 21st century. So let's keep this around.
Well, I think, part of our work is sort of sharing the history so that, the public can appreciate what is still left and its potential for.
Well, I think the public does have a pretty strong appreciation of it. I think, if you go to that Industrial New Haven website and look at the Bigelow, I think it was it. There are a lot of comments of people saying, oh, what a shame, couldn't have been reversed. I mean, I think there is a lot of interest, both from a history point of view, but also just sort of a general New Haven identity point of view, that having some of this stuff around makes our lives richer in almost an indefinable way, but I think a real way. And I do think that's a widespread perception. Unfortunately, everything has to go right to save a historic industrial building. 1 or 2 things go wrong. I'll give you an example. U-Haul is occupying it now, and I didn't talk a lot about railroad structures, But, you know, the railroad itself was a major New Haven industry employing thousands of people. The streetcar system was a major industry employing hundreds, if not thousands of people. And that trolley barn up on State Street that U-Haul has now, that was set to be rehabbed. And the developer, this was a few years ago, the developer got a quote of like $8 million just to fix the roof. Kind of a deal breaker, right? There's just a lot of things that can go wrong with a rehab. Everything has to go right.
All right. Well, I was hoping to end on a, slightly.
Oh, I'm sorry, downer. I'm sorry.
Optimistic note, but I think that's it's a sobering thought, and obviously this topic is huge, and we can go down it endlessly, and perhaps there will be a follow-up talk about
Well, if we do a follow-up talk on deindustrialization, I can't say that's going to be
okay.
a cheery thing.
Well,
No,
right.
Look, we can appreciate all of this. We are the product of so many generations of hard work, of innovation, of striving to create something. What we have left, we can appreciate it and celebrate it, really. I think it deserves celebration. I think maybe we don't celebrate it enough.
Yeah, I do think a great future topic would be, successful case studies as well.
Yeah.
Of, preservation and
well, I think that one thing that gives me hope, perhaps, but in a very perverse way, is I have noticed some developments in New Haven that are not in old buildings, but look like they are conversion of old buildings. Do you know the ones I mean on State Street? It's kind of like they're building.
I sure do.
Oh, were you involved in that?
No, I was not.
It's almost like they're building new old buildings. So I think that's hold some hope for the genuine old buildings as well.
All right. Well,
thank you very much. I'm glad you were glad to have people listening to me, and I hope that it was worthwhile, at least in part.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bruce, for your time and your expertise.
Okay.
And thank you everyone for joining us and for spending a bit of your Sunday afternoon here. And if you enjoyed this talk, please consider joining the Trust as a member. You can find membership information and many other resources at the Trust's website, which is nhpt.org. And stay tuned for upcoming events this spring.
Okay, I'll say my farewells now. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, everyone.